Hello, thanks for joining us. You've been watching our Reporters Plus program. In recent months, the situation on the ground in Myanmar has reached somewhat of a new phase. An offensive by an alliance of ethnic armed groups has emerged as the biggest threat to the regime since its power grab. The alliance is supported by rebel groups like CERI, who we saw in that report, many of them young people determined to defeat the army. Well, will the rebels and alliance win the armed conflict? Can democracy ever be restored in Myanmar? And what role have regional powers played in all of this? Well, these are just some of the questions that we'll be looking to tackle now. And to break down the situation on the ground, we'll be speaking to the reporter who produced the piece you just watched. That's Constantin Simon, France 24's Asia correspondent. Thanks for joining us, Constantin. And in the studio to help us delve deeper, David Camroux, who is here with us. He's an honorary senior research fellow and professor at Sciences Po here in Paris. Thanks for being with us, David. So, Constantin, I'll begin with you. Let's sort of set the scene for the viewers in terms of what kind of conditions you had to produce this report under. You mentioned in your piece that journalists aren't generally welcomed in Myanmar. In the 3 years since the junta has seized power, Reporters Without Borders says 4 journalists have been killed, 150 have been arrested or imprisoned, and 61 are still being held in jail. So it's against this backdrop that you had to produce this report. And on top of that, you're having to follow these rebels who are under constant threat of attacks. Give us an insight into how difficult it was for you to produce this piece.
Well, definitely entering into Myanmar and traveling into Myanmar was not an easy task because, as you said, journalists, and especially foreign journalists, are not welcome. I cannot really tell you how I entered into the country, but definitely I didn't get a visa. And we had to travel through a jungle, we had to take small roads, and we had to avoid military base from the Myanmar army, also their planes, their drones. So it was not an easy travel, but I would say I was also quite surprised to see that in the region I was traveling, the rebels actually have gained more control than the Myanmar army, and they have checkpoints, they control village, they have taken police station, and they're building a new state. It's not the case, of course, in all the country, but in the Kaya state, where I was, the Karenni region, it is the case, and it was not so complicated in that aspect. It became more complicated when we reached Loiko, which is the capital of the state of Kaya, of the Karenni region, and that's a very strategic and important city for the junta, because the city of Loiko is only about 200 kilometers from the capital of the country, Naypyidaw. So the junta doesn't want to lose that city, and that's where the heavy fighting is happening, with daily shelling, bombings, with the planes of the Myanmar army that the junta bought from Russia and China, as you saw in the report. And that's where the fightings are really happening, and where the situation was complicated.
So that's the situation on the ground at the moment. So let's go back to the beginning of all of this, David. On the 1st of February 2021, we see that soldiers from Myanmar's armed forces arrest the de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi and other members of her ruling party. Tell us why the army took over.
Well, it basically comes down to the personal desire, lust for power of Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the junta, who never accepted the fact that there was a civilian leader, and the power-sharing arrangement, or hybrid regime, was one that the NLD, the party of Aung San Suu Kyi, wished to change, to give greater power to the civilian branch. So he was about to retire in September of that year, and he knew that this was his final chance to have absolute power.
And soon after that coup that we've been speaking about, there was widespread protests across the country, and there was a ton of international condemnation that the event obviously drew. Those demonstrations were met with a brutal crackdown, which pushed protesters to find other ways of fighting back. Now, Constantin, tell us about the resistance and how it's been set up, because on the one hand, you have the Brotherhood Alliance, who are made up of 3 ethnic groups, but then you also have these rebel groups like CERI, who you follow in your report.
Yes, Myanmar is a very complicated country with more than 100 ethnic groups, and there has been a long tradition of ethnic armies. In the region where I was, a Karenni army has been created in 1957. So there has been decades of civil war and fightings. It's maybe one of the longest civil war in the world. But I was also very surprised by those young new army. I mean, the Karenni Army is from 1957, but the KNDF, the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force, that I follow mostly in the reports with the Commander Maui that you've seen, has been created after the coup. So it's a mix of old ethnic armies and young armies, and I was also very surprised by the age, because in all those groups, the old armies and the young ones, the fighters are all young, and there has been a huge, maybe thousands or tens of thousands of Burmese joining the ranks of those armies after the coup.
And tell us about the latest on the ground in terms of what kind of gains the Brotherhood Alliance and the rebels are making. Some say the junta are losing the war. They've recently enforced conscription in the country. Is this a sign that they're struggling in terms of numbers?
I mean, especially since the autumn and the launch of the Brotherhood Alliance offensive on 27 last October, there has been clearly a huge crisis for the Myanmar army that has lost about 400 outposts and about 30 cities. So it was a huge surprise. So I would say that it was a huge crisis for the Myanmar army, which is also facing big problems. With soldiers killed, with soldiers surrendering themselves or fleeing to other countries like India. But recently there has been maybe a stabilization of the conflict, especially in the city of Loiko, where I was. The rebels in the months of November, December have gained a lot of territory, but at the moment the situation is a bit like stabilized because the rebels are lacking ammunition. So in one hand you have an army which is in a huge crisis and imposing the conscription, and in the other hand you have rebels which are in some parts missing ammunition, and also some small ceasefire which have been implemented, especially with the help of China, but which are not really conclusive on the ground.
Well, it sounds like both sides are clearly struggling here. What chance do you think the armed group has of winning the war?
Well, I think, to quote Winston Churchill after Eleanor, we're at the end of the beginning, but we're not quite sure we're at the beginning of the end. That is to say that the military is in desperate straits. Not only do they reimpose conscription, but they're sending non-combatants, technical staff to fight on the front line. People just out of the military academy I read today are being sent immediately to the front line. They're asking the wives of military personnel to man the garrisons while their husbands are away. And the Minan Lung himself is now being subject to criticism, particularly from the nationalist monks who have supported him so far. So it is a junta in somewhat desperate straits. But this is just one front in the war. There's a military front, but there are two other fronts that are far less visible. The second front is that of preparing for after the end of what I think can be called a revolutionary civil war. And that, behind the radar screen, we have a government in exile, which is a functioning government. The military now only controls about half of the country, half of the towns. And in the areas controlled now by the People's Defence Forces, by these ethnic armed groups, they are setting up sort of local administrations which are functioning. And that government, has ministries, it collects taxes. And all it's required is some kind of recognition from the international community. It is, after all, a government which emanates from the elections of October, November 2020, which the military overthrew. So there is this enormous effort going on behind to prepare for what has eluded Myanmar since independence, which is the creation of a federal democracy. And now we're getting there. The junta has had one great success, they have created a unity against themselves. They've created a sense of national unity which goes across the ethnic barriers between the 60% Burma, involves these other ethnic groups, and it actually includes also the Rohingya, who've just published today a declaration of support for the revolutionary struggle. So that war is, that's another front. And there's a third front, which is one in which the international community has an important role to play, which is with the regional partners and recognition of, for example, the National Unity Government. And there we have a problem, because we have three neighbors which are ideologically blind. China, India, and Thailand. And their ideological blindness has prevented them from seeing that it is in their own self-interest that a democratic federal Myanmar emerges after this ethnic civil war, after this revolutionary civil war.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the role that China has played in all of this. From what I've seen, China has almost been playing both sides. They've been putting pressure on, or sort of helping the military to put pressure on the Brotherhood Alliance and other rebel groups, but then also they're helping the Brotherhood Alliance. So what's their strategy in all of this?
Well, there are multiple Chinas. I mean, there's Beijing, but there's also Yunnan, the closest province. And the regional policies towards Myanmar may not be the same thing as that being orchestrated from Beijing. And there's also, you have sort of, you have business groups, you have criminal groups who are conducting another kind of policy. I think when I talk about the ideological blindness from Beijing, they cannot accept the idea that a democratic Myanmar is actually in their best interests. The best relations that China ever had in Myanmar were during the period of the government Aung San Suu Kyi from 2015 to 2020. At that period, China's legitimate strategic interests, especially energy security, were protected. And they cannot sort of accept the fact that actually, to have a government which is accepted by the population is in their best interest. Because for the moment, you can have pipelines to bring petrol from Middle East and gas from the Bay of Bengal. But if you're in a situation of such instability, that energy security is not going to be protected. So there's an ideological blindness there from the Chinese side. The one party we never talk about sufficiently is India. I mean, Gandhi and Nehru must be turning in their grave to see how complicit the Hindu nationalist government of Narendra Modi has been with the junta. And again, this is ideological blindness, because the Indians never quite accepted the Christianization of that buffer areas. And they support the junta because they're worried about insurgencies in the northeastern states of India. But once again, it's only through a peaceful resolution that borders can be stabilized, that the 1 million Rohingya refugees can return from Bangladesh and from India, and that, India can have a situation in which it can then develop what it wishes to build, which is a pathway towards Thailand. And that's not impossible at the moment in this period of civil war.
So we're seeing, India playing a massive role in this as well. I'll just go back to China and I'll come back to you, Constantin, because I want you to tell us about what sort of moves you've seen Beijing making on the ground.
Yes, traditionally, Beijing is a big ally of the junta, furnishing, selling planes, as you have seen in the reports. But it's quite interesting to see that on the ground, China and some regional power were quite unhappy with the chaos that this war, these movements, and the coup has created, especially on the border, because a lot of mafia have settled there, and especially settling scam centers, which are like huge huge cities where a lot of people are working like slaves to scam people through internet. And that has been a huge problem for China. And the rebels, which have in this region a proximity and old cultural relation with Chinese, have clearly said in their manifesto, the Three Brotherhood Alliance, that they want to clean the scam center, which in a way cleaning the mafia and that's why it is said that China has been supportive to these rebel groups and not saying no, at least, to the movement.
And let's go back to young people in all of this. They've obviously played a massive role in the CERI. Most of the members of that rebel group are young people. In your report, you start off with Daniel, who's just 23 years old. Tell us about the role that young people are playing in all this.
Yeah, I was very surprised by the age of all those people, because we always talk about ethnic arms group, and we always have the impression that those ethnic armies are very old, and they are in some aspect. But also, I mean, all the soldiers I've seen, they were all around 20, and the commander I've followed in the report is just about 30 years old. So it's a really young movement, and I would say 95% of the rebels I've interviewed had joined after the coup. So those are students, those are young workers, and they have all joined. And I think this conscription may have a reverse impact, actually. The conscription is supposed to help the Myanmar army to gather more troops, but it could have the contrary effect and push more young people to actually join the rebels.
The Assistance Association for Political Prisoners, which has been monitoring the crackdown, says some 4,341 civilians have been killed. The true numbers could be much higher. Nurses in your report accuse the junta of violating the Geneva Convention by targeting civilians and the wounded. How much evidence is there that the army could be committing atrocities?
I mean, it's clear, and I've seen some schools, like you've seen in the reports, or other places, refugee camps, villages, which have been bombed by the Myanmar army. And that is why the Myanmar army is hugely unpopular in this region. So it's difficult to, I mean, there will be a need of a proper investigation, of course. But it's clear for the people living there that this army, their army, we have to remind that those people are Burmese, are citizens of Myanmar, and they actually see their own armies bombing themselves, killing themselves, and that's why they are calling, as you have seen in the reports, children speaking about military dogs. That's how they call their own army.
David, let's look at the future and what sort of steps Myanmar can take now. What does the future hold for the country? If pro-democracy groups like CERI, like the rebels, if they do end up winning the conflict, will democracy actually be restored in the country?
It will be a messy, complicated process. But what is different this time around, because Myanmar has, in 1988, there was also a movement. What is different amongst the young people is democracy is something they had tasted. That wasn't the case previously. And there's no turning back on this. The other aspect which is different is that this is also a rejection, not just of the military, but of a patriarchal society. You can see more and more women involved. And it's also a rejection of that. So this is something really quite profound and revolutionary. So where does that lead us? It leads us to, and this is where the second front is so important, what is happening politically in preparing, which is beyond below the radar screen. And this is occurring in a very serious way. They're preparing for the situation afterwards. A roadmap, an interim government, a transition, a new constitution, which will be voted upon, and significant autonomy to the ethnic groups and the ethnic communities on the periphery. And that will require incredible investment, but not all that major investment we see is happening in Ukraine and in Israel from the international community in terms of peacekeepers, in terms of financial assistance. Myanmar's got so much going for it. It is a young country. It has a dynamic population, a young population, essentially quite well educated. It has enormous natural resources. So it's not a basket case. It's become a basket case because for 80 years it's had appalling political leadership from the military. It begins with a recognition, for example, of the national unity government.
Okay.
It begins by helping destroy the only military advantage which the military has, which is the control of the skies, that is destroying their capacity to bomb the hell out of civilian populations. And this is a question of political will on the part of the international community.
So it seems that the international community will have to play a bigger role here. Thank you so much for your insights, David Camroux. David Camroux, who is an honorary senior research fellow at Sciences Po. And then also, I want to also say thank you to Constantin, who produced the report, which gave us an incredible insight into the young people leading the struggle against the army in Myanmar. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Reporters Plus, and do stay tuned to France 24.